In the scorching heart of San Antonio, Texas, where the summer of 1919 brought temperatures that made stone sweat and turned church interiors into ovens, there exists a story that the Catholic Church tried desperately to bury beneath layers of plaster and prayers. The Mission San Jose, with its ornate Baroque facade and bell tower that had called the faithful for over 150 years, was undergoing extensive renovation work. The structure had begun showing signs of serious deterioration, cracks spreading through walls like spider webs, sections of plaster crumbling to reveal the ancient limestone beneath. What the workers discovered on a suffocating August afternoon, when they broke through a section of wall behind the main altar, was something that no amount of prayer could explain. A perfectly preserved body of a young woman in a wedding dress, sealed inside a hidden chamber, barely large enough to contain her, her skeletal hand still clutching a bouquet of long-dead roses. Her face, partially mummified by the dry Texas heat and the limestone walls, was frozen in an expression that witnesses would later describe as neither peaceful nor agonized, but something far more disturbing, a look of profound betrayal. What they didn't know was that this bride had been missing for exactly 40 years, that her disappearance on her wedding day in 1879 had torn the small community apart, and that the truth about what happened in those sacred walls would reveal a conspiracy of silence, forbidden love, and a fate that challenged every assumption about the sanctity of holy ground. This is the story of Rosa Maria Delgado, a woman who walked into a church to be married and never walked out, whose final moments were witnessed only by God and one other person, a person who chose damnation over exposure. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. San Antonio in 1879 was a city caught between two worlds, the fading influence of its Spanish colonial past and the rough expansion of American frontier society. The Mission San Jose, located 3 miles south of the main plaza, served a community of predominantly Mexican families who had lived in the area for generations. The mission compound included not just the church itself, but also a small cemetery, a priest's residence, and several outbuildings that had once housed the mission's agricultural operations. Father Sebastian Montoya had served as the mission's priest for 23 years, arriving from Mexico City in 1856 as a young man full of religious zeal and romantic notions about frontier ministry. By 1879, he was 46 years old, his black hair streaked with gray, his face weathered by the Texas sun, his faith tested by decades of witnessing poverty, violence, and the slow erosion of the community he served. He was known as a compassionate pastor who spoke both Spanish and English fluently, who performed marriages and baptisms without charging the customary fees when families couldn't afford them, and who kept the mission church open at all hours for anyone seeking sanctuary or solace. What his parishioners didn't know was that Father Montoya carried a secret that had been eating at his soul for years, a transgression that he confessed daily in private prayer, but could never bring himself to confess to another priest. Rosa Maria Delgado was born in 1858, the youngest daughter of Vicente and Guadalupe Delgado, respected members of the mission community. Vicente worked as a master stonemason, his skills in high demand for both construction and repair work throughout San Antonio. Guadalupe was known for her skill with medicinal herbs and often assisted in childbirth, a vital service in a community where formal medical care was expensive and often unavailable. Rosa Maria grew up in a modest stone house near the mission, helping her mother with herb gardens and learning the traditional remedies that had been passed down through generations. She was a striking young woman, with dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of emotion, thick black hair that fell to her waist when unbound, and a voice that made the church choir sound like heaven itself when she sang during Mass. By the time she reached 18 years old in 1876, several young men from the community had expressed interest in courting her. But Rosa Maria seemed in no hurry to marry. She spent her time helping her mother, working in the mission's charitable efforts, and most notably, spending hours in the church itself, often staying long after services had ended, kneeling in prayer before the statue of the Virgin Mary. Father Montoya first noticed Rosa Maria's extended time in the church during the winter of 1876. He would find her there in the early morning when he came to prepare for Mass, kneeling in the same pew near the front, her lips moving in silent prayer, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white. He initially assumed she was praying for something specific, perhaps a sick family member or guidance about her future, and he made a point to ask her casually after Mass one Sunday if everything was well with her family. Rosa Maria had looked at him with those profound, dark eyes and said quietly that she was praying for understanding of God's will for her life, that she felt called to something but wasn't certain what that calling meant. Father Montoya, in his role as spiritual advisor, suggested they have a conversation about religious vocations, thinking perhaps the young woman was considering becoming a nun. They began meeting once a week in the small office attached to the priest's residence, ostensibly to discuss spiritual matters and explore whether Rosa Maria had a calling to religious life. These meetings were perfectly proper, the door always left partially open. Their conversations focused on scripture and theology. But something shifted over the months of 1877. The conversations gradually became more personal, moving from abstract theological discussions to intimate revelations about doubts, fears, and desires. Father Montoya found himself looking forward to these meetings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with pastoral duty. Found himself thinking about Rosa Maria's questions and observations long after she had left. Found his dreams increasingly troubled by her presence. Rosa Maria, for her part, had fallen deeply in love with Father Montoya, though she struggled to understand or accept this impossible feeling. She knew the priest's vows, knew the absolute prohibition against such attachments, knew that what she felt was not just improper but potentially damning to both their souls. Yet, she couldn't stop the feelings that overwhelmed her when she was near him, couldn't prevent herself from finding excuses to speak with him, couldn't ignore the way his voice made her heart race, or the way his presence made the rest of the world seem to fade into insignificance. By the spring of 1878, both Father Montoya and Rosa Maria were trapped in an emotional entanglement that neither had intended and neither knew how to escape. They hadn't crossed any physical boundaries, their relationship remaining entirely chaste. But the emotional intimacy between them had grown to the point where both recognized they were standing on the edge of a precipice. Father Montoya knew he should end the private meetings, should distance himself from Rosa Maria, should perhaps even request a transfer to another parish. But he found himself unable to take any of these necessary steps, rationalizing that he was helping a young woman with genuine spiritual questions, that their conversations remained within appropriate bounds, that his feelings, however inappropriate, were under control, as long as they remained unspoken and unacted upon. The crisis came in June of 1878, when Rosa Maria's parents informed her that they had accepted a marriage proposal on her behalf from Diego Ruiz, a prosperous merchant from San Antonio who had recently lost his wife to cholera and was seeking a new bride. Diego was 38 years old, well established, and considered an excellent match for a young woman of Rosa Maria's modest background. The wedding was set for September 14, 1879, giving the families over a year to make proper preparations and allowing Rosa Maria time to adjust to the idea of her future. Rosa Maria was devastated by this announcement. Though she couldn't explain to her parents why the thought of marrying Diego filled her with such horror, she went immediately to the church and poured out her anguish to Father Montoya, confessing for the first time the true nature of her feelings for him. The priest listened with growing dismay, as Rosa Maria revealed that she had been in love with him for over a year, that she had been praying desperately for these feelings to disappear, that she couldn't bear the thought of marrying another man, while her heart belonged entirely to someone she could never have. Father Montoya should have ended the conversation immediately, should have gently but firmly explained that such feelings were impossible, and that she needed to confess this attachment as a sin and work to overcome it. Instead, he found himself confessing his own feelings, admitting that he too had been struggling with emotions that violated his vows, that the thought of her marrying another man caused him pain that he couldn't rationally explain. They sat together in the dim church as the afternoon light faded, two people caught in an impossible situation, their unspoken feelings now laid bare between them. For the next 15 months, as preparations for Rosa Maria's wedding continued, she and Father Montoya maintained a relationship that existed in a strange liminal space between propriety and transgression. They never touched beyond the formal gestures required by his role as priest, never spoke explicitly about their feelings again after that initial confession, but they continued to meet regularly, ostensibly to discuss Rosa Maria's spiritual preparation for marriage. These meetings became increasingly tortured affairs, with both of them acutely aware of everything that remained unsaid, both of them counting down the days until the wedding would force a final separation. Rosa Maria grew thinner over these months, her eyes taking on a haunted quality that her mother attributed to normal pre-wedding anxiety. She went through the motions of wedding preparations with mechanical efficiency, selecting fabric for her dress, learning recipes from her mother to please her future husband, accepting gifts and advice from married women in the community. But those who knew her well noticed that she seemed to be fading, as if some essential spark was being slowly extinguished. Father Montoya threw himself into his pastoral duties with almost manic energy, volunteering for every sick call, every emergency, every request for his time and attention. He spent hours in prayer, begging for the strength to let Rosa Maria go, for the wisdom to guide her properly toward her new life, for forgiveness for the feelings he couldn't seem to conquer. He considered requesting a transfer, but couldn't bring himself to take that step. Couldn't imagine not seeing Rosa Maria at Mass each Sunday. Couldn't face the idea of some other priest performing her marriage ceremony. In his private journal, discovered years later by church officials, Father Montoya wrote entries that revealed his deteriorating mental state. August 3, 1879, he wrote, "I am being torn apart by love and duty, by desire and vows, by the man I am and the priest I am supposed to be. I pray constantly for the strength to do what is right, but I fear I have already lost the battle, that I crossed some invisible line months ago, and have been in a state of mortal sin ever since. God forgive me, but I cannot imagine a world in which Rosa Maria belongs to another man, and I cannot imagine a world in which she could be mine. I am trapped in a hell of my own creation." The week before the wedding, Rosa Maria came to the church every day, often staying for hours, sometimes speaking with Father Montoya in his office, sometimes simply kneeling in prayer. The other women of the parish assumed she was making her spiritual preparations for marriage, as was traditional. Only Father Montoya saw the desperation in her eyes. Only he heard the barely controlled tremor in her voice when she spoke. On September 13th, the day before the wedding, Rosa Maria came to the church in the late afternoon for what would be their final private conversation. She told Father Montoya quietly that she couldn't go through with the marriage, that she would rather die than spend her life with a man she didn't love, pretending feelings she didn't have, living a lie that would stretch across decades. She asked him, her voice breaking, if there was any way, any possibility, any loophole in church law or divine mercy that would allow them to be together. Father Montoya, his own voice thick with emotion, told her what he had told himself 1,000 times over the past 15 months, that his vows were absolute, that his commitment to God superseded all earthly attachments, that what they felt for each other, however real and powerful, was a temptation that must be resisted, a test of faith that they were failing. He told her that she must marry Diego Ruiz, that she must build a life with him, that in time these impossible feelings would fade, and she would find contentment if not happiness. He told her that he would pray for her every day, that he would perform her wedding ceremony with dignity and care, and that afterward they must maintain proper distance, that their private meetings must end, that she must become simply another parishioner. Rosa Maria listened to all of this with tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her fingers had gone white. When Father Montoya finished speaking, she stood slowly and walked to the church door. She turned back once, looking at him with an expression that he would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, and said softly that she understood what duty required, that she would honor her parents' wishes and marry Diego Ruiz, but that he should know that she would die loving him, that nothing in her life would ever be as real as what she felt in this moment, and that she hoped God would be merciful to them both for this impossible love. Then she left, and Father Montoya sat alone in the darkening church, feeling as if something essential inside him had been ripped away. September 14, 1879, dawned hot and clear, the kind of perfect late summer day that seemed designed for celebrations. The wedding was scheduled for 3 p.m., giving the mission community time to finish morning chores and prepare for the ceremony. Rosa Maria's dress had been made by the finest seamstress in San Antonio, white silk with intricate lacework, a style that combined traditional Mexican elements with more modern American fashions. Her mother and aunts helped her dress in the small stone house, weeping with joy at how beautiful she looked, offering the traditional advice and blessings given to Mexican brides. Rosa Maria accepted all of this with a quiet grace that her mother later described as almost ethereal, as if she had achieved some kind of peace or acceptance. The bride arrived at the church at 2:45 p.m., accompanied by her parents and a small procession of family members. She carried a bouquet of white roses from her mother's garden, their petals perfect and pristine in the afternoon heat. As was customary, she waited in a small antechamber near the church entrance while the guests assembled, and the groom took his position at the altar with Father Montoya. Diego Ruiz looked nervous but pleased, dressed in his finest suit, flanked by his 2 adult sons from his first marriage who would serve as witnesses. The church filled with friends and family, the women in their best dresses, the men in suits saved for special occasions, everyone eager to witness what promised to be one of the social highlights of the mission community's year. At 3 p.m. exactly, the church bells rang to signal the start of the ceremony. But Rosa Maria Delgado did not appear. The congregation waited, assuming some minor delay with the bride's preparations. After 5 minutes, Rosa Maria's mother went to check on her daughter in the antechamber. She found the small room empty, the door standing slightly open, Rosa Maria's shawl draped over a chair. The bride had vanished. The immediate assumption was that Rosa Maria had suffered an attack of nerves and run off, perhaps needing a few minutes of air before she could gather the courage to proceed with the ceremony. Diego Ruiz, looking more embarrassed than concerned, suggested they give her some time. Rosa Maria's father and brothers began searching the mission grounds, checking the cemetery, the outbuildings, the gardens. But there was no sign of the bride. As minutes stretched into an hour, the search expanded. Men fanned out through the surrounding area, checking the road back to town, the nearby river, anywhere a confused and frightened young woman might have fled. Women stayed at the church, some praying, some whispering theories about what might have happened. Diego Ruiz grew increasingly agitated, clearly viewing this disappearance as a personal humiliation. Father Montoya, his face pale and expressionless, helped coordinate the search while struggling with his own terrible suspicions about what might have happened. By nightfall, Rosa Maria Delgado had still not been found. Her parents were frantic, her brothers were organizing a more extensive search for the following day, and Diego Ruiz had returned to San Antonio in a fury, declaring that he would never agree to marry a woman who had so publicly shamed him. The mission community was in turmoil, with rumors spreading wildly about what might have caused the bride to flee. Some suggested that Diego had mistreated her during their brief courtship. Others that Rosa Maria had been secretly in love with someone else. Still others that she had suffered some kind of mental breakdown brought on by wedding anxiety. The search for Rosa Maria continued for weeks, then months. Her father spent his savings hiring trackers and investigators. Notices were posted in San Antonio and surrounding communities. Local authorities were notified, though they devoted minimal resources to what they assumed was simply a case of a young woman who had chosen to run away rather than marry. No body was found, no trace of Rosa Maria ever surfaced, and gradually the community was forced to accept that she had somehow managed to completely disappear. Theories about her fate ranged from the plausible to the fantastic. Some believed she had run away to Mexico to start a new life. Others thought she might have been kidnapped by bandits or Indians. A few suggested she had drowned in the river, and her body had been carried away by the current. Rosa Maria's mother never stopped believing that her daughter was alive somewhere, that someday she would return with an explanation for her disappearance. Her father, more pragmatic, eventually concluded that Rosa Maria had died on her wedding day, though he could never accept not knowing where or how. The wedding dress, never worn, was carefully preserved by Rosa Maria's mother, who couldn't bring herself to destroy something that represented so much hope and preparation. Father Montoya continued his duties at Mission San Jose, but those who knew him well noticed a change in the priest. After Rosa Maria's disappearance, he became more withdrawn, more prone to long periods of solitary prayer, his sermons taking on a darker tone focused on sin, guilt, and the terrible consequences of failing to follow God's commandments. He never spoke publicly about his relationship with Rosa Maria, and there's no evidence that he confessed what he knew to church authorities. But his private journal, kept locked in a desk in his residence, told a different story. In entries written in the days and weeks after September 14, 1879, Father Montoya revealed that Rosa Maria had not run away on her wedding day. She had come to him in the church that afternoon, in the final moments before the ceremony was to begin. She had found him in the sacristy where he was preparing for the service, and she had begged him one final time to help her escape this marriage, to give her sanctuary, to acknowledge that what they felt for each other was more important than vows or duty, or what society expected. Father Montoya had refused, had told her firmly that she must go through with the ceremony, that he would not help her dishonor her family, or break her commitment to Diego Ruiz. Rosa Maria, according to his journal, had looked at him with those deep, dark eyes and said quietly that if she couldn't have the life she wanted, she didn't want life at all, that she would rather be with God than trapped in a loveless marriage. Father Montoya had assumed this was dramatic rhetoric born of emotional distress, had not taken seriously what he now realized was a clear statement of intent. Rosa Maria had left the sacristy, and Father Montoya had assumed she was returning to the antechamber to compose herself before the ceremony. What he didn't know was that Rosa Maria had walked instead to a small storage area behind the main altar, a space used to keep extra candles, vestments, and other church supplies. This area was separated from the main church by a thick stone wall with a narrow door that was kept locked except when the supplies were needed. Rosa Maria had taken the key from its hook in the sacristy, and she had locked herself in this small chamber. The storage area was barely 6 feet by 8 feet, with a low ceiling and no windows. It was designed purely for practical storage, not for human occupancy. The walls were thick limestone, the same material used throughout the mission's construction, chosen for its ability to stay cool in the Texas heat and its resistance to decay. In this tiny sealed space, Rosa Maria Delgado had made a terrible decision. Rather than face a life she couldn't bear, rather than marry a man she didn't love while her heart belonged to someone she could never have, she had chosen to end her existence in the one place that had always been her sanctuary. She had sat down in her perfect white wedding dress, had arranged the roses carefully in her hands, and had simply waited to die. The limestone walls that made the chamber cool also made it nearly airtight when the door was sealed. With no ventilation and limited oxygen, Rosa Maria would have gradually lost consciousness as carbon dioxide built up in the small space. Her death would have been relatively peaceful, a gradual fading of awareness rather than violent struggle, though the psychological torment that led her to choose this fate was anything but peaceful. Father Montoya, reading his breviary in the sacristy while the congregation waited for the bride to appear, had no idea that Rosa Maria was dying less than 30 feet away from where he sat. By the time the search began, she had likely been dead for over an hour, her body sealed behind walls so thick that no amount of calling her name would have reached her. The priest didn't realize what had happened until later that night, when he noticed that the key to the storage room was missing from its hook. A cold dread had settled over him as he unlocked the door and found Rosa Maria's body, still beautiful in her wedding dress, the roses clutched in her hands, her face showing the peaceful expression of someone who had simply fallen asleep. For several agonizing hours, Father Montoya had grappled with what to do. He could reveal what he had found, could explain that Rosa Maria had taken her own life in the church, could allow her family the terrible closure of knowing her fate. But such a revelation would raise impossible questions. Why had Rosa Maria chosen this particular place to die? Why had she locked herself in a storage room behind the altar? What had driven her to such desperation? Any investigation would eventually uncover their emotional relationship, would reveal that a priest and a parishioner had been meeting privately for over a year, would destroy not just Father Montoya's reputation, but also Rosa Maria's memory and her family's standing in the community. In the darkest moment of his life, Father Montoya had made a decision that would haunt him until his death. Rather than reveal Rosa Maria's body, he had sealed her inside the wall. The storage room already felt like a tomb, its thick limestone walls and lack of windows creating a space that seemed designed for burial. Working through the night by candlelight, Father Montoya had used his limited knowledge of masonry, learned from observing parishioners who worked in construction, to seal the door to the storage room with plaster and stone. He had matched the texture and color of the surrounding wall as closely as possible, had moved a heavy cabinet to partially obscure the area where the door had been, had created what appeared to be simply another section of the solid wall behind the altar. Rosa Maria's body, perfectly preserved in the cool, dry, sealed chamber, had become part of the church itself. Her wedding dress became her burial shroud, her bouquet of roses her only grave marker, the limestone walls her casket. Father Montoya had then played his part in the search for the missing bride, had comforted her devastated parents, had led prayers for her safe return, all while knowing exactly where she was and what he had done. His journal entries from the years following this event revealed a man being slowly destroyed by guilt and secrecy. He wrote obsessively about Rosa Maria, about his feelings for her, about the terrible choice he had made to conceal her death, rather than face the consequences of their relationship. He described hearing her voice in the church at night, feeling her presence during Mass, seeing her face in every young woman who came to confession. He practiced increasingly severe forms of penance, fasting until he grew gaunt, sleeping on the bare floor, spending hours in painful positions of prayer. But no amount of suffering could absolve him of what he had done, could undo the betrayal of sealing the woman he loved inside a wall and allowing her family to suffer decades of uncertainty about her fate. Father Montoya died in 1903 at the age of 70, having served the mission San Jose for 47 years. He was remembered as a dedicated priest who had grown increasingly ascetic and withdrawn in his later years, who seemed to carry some great burden that he never shared with anyone. His journal, carefully locked away in his desk, was discovered by the priest who succeeded him but was not fully read until 1919, when church officials were investigating the discovery of Rosa Maria's body. The renovation work that led to the discovery of Rosa Maria Delgado's remains was motivated by concerns about structural integrity in the church's older sections. Workers had been systematically examining and reinforcing walls throughout the building when they encountered a section behind the altar that sounded hollow when tapped, suggesting either a void in the construction or some kind of hidden chamber. When they carefully removed the outer layer of plaster, they found evidence of newer masonry that didn't match the church's original construction, stone and mortar that appeared to have been added sometime in the late 1800s. Curious about this irregularity, they had continued removing material until they revealed the original door frame and eventually broke through into the sealed chamber. The smell that emerged when the chamber was finally opened was not the expected odor of decay, but rather a dry, musty scent, like that of very old paper. The workers, their eyes adjusting to the darkness inside, saw first the white of the wedding dress, then the skeletal hands still wrapped around the stems of long-dead roses, then the face, partially mummified by the dry conditions, the skin like leather stretched over bone, but still recognizably human. The worker who first saw the body would later say that what disturbed him most was not the corpse itself, but the expression on the face, not fear or pain, but something that looked almost like resignation or relief. The discovery caused an immediate sensation in San Antonio. The wedding dress, though yellowed with age, was still identifiable as being from the late 1870s. The roses, though reduced to brittle stems and a few fragments of petals, were still clutched in the body's hands. Most significantly, a small religious medal found around the skeleton's neck was inscribed with the name Rosa Delgado and a date of birth that matched church records. The bride, who had vanished on her wedding day 40 years earlier, had been in the church all along, sealed inside a wall less than 30 feet from where her devastated family had prayed for her safe return. Church officials, confronted with this impossible situation, launched an immediate investigation into how and why a body had been sealed inside their church. This investigation led to the discovery of Father Montoya's journal, which had been stored with other church records, but never examined. The journal's revelations about the priest's relationship with Rosa Maria and his decision to conceal her death created a scandal that reached all the way to the archdiocese level. Church authorities faced difficult questions about how a priest could have sealed a body inside a church wall without being discovered, about whether there had been other instances of impropriety that had been covered up, about what responsibility the church bore for what had happened to Rosa Maria Delgado. Rosa Maria's surviving family members, including her elderly brothers and several nieces and nephews, were finally able to lay her to rest in the mission cemetery. Her funeral in October 1919 was attended by hundreds of people, both those who remembered her disappearance 40 years earlier and younger generations who were fascinated by the tragic story. She was buried in the wedding dress that had become her accidental burial shroud, the dress that her mother had preserved for so many years in the hope that Rosa Maria might someday return to wear it. The roses that she had clutched for 40 years were buried with her, the only witnesses to her final moments. The scandal surrounding Father Montoya's actions and the Church's handling of the situation led to significant changes in how the archdiocese managed its properties and supervised its priests. The Mission San Jose underwent extensive documentation and inspection to ensure there were no other hidden chambers or undiscovered secrets. Father Montoya's journal was sealed in church archives, with access restricted to official researchers, though excerpts were leaked to newspapers and became the basis for sensationalized accounts of the story. The chamber where Rosa Maria's body had been found was left empty for several years, with church officials debating what to do with this space that had served as an accidental tomb. Eventually, it was converted into a small chapel dedicated to Rosa Maria's memory, with a plaque that simply stated her name, her dates of birth and death, and a prayer for her soul. This chapel became a place where people came to pray for those trapped in impossible situations, for those whose love could find no proper expression, for all the souls caught between duty and desire. The story of Rosa Maria Delgado and Father Sebastián Montoya became part of San Antonio's dark historical canon, told and retold in various versions over the decades. Some versions romanticized their relationship, portraying it as a tragic love story worthy of Shakespeare. Others focused on Father Montoya's betrayal and the moral failure of a priest who chose to conceal a death rather than face the consequences of his actions. Still others emphasized Rosa Maria's agency in choosing death over a life she found unbearable, framing her story as a critique of the limited options available to women in 19th-century society. Psychologists and historians have debated what Father Montoya's journal reveals about his mental state and decision-making. His choice to seal Rosa Maria's body inside the wall, rather than reveal her death, suggests a psychological break, a moment when the pressure of maintaining his secret relationship overwhelmed his judgment and moral compass. His subsequent decades of guilt and penance indicate that he never reconciled himself with what he had done, that he understood the magnitude of his betrayal of both Rosa Maria and her family. Some scholars argue that Father Montoya's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of a man trapped between incompatible commitments, his vows as a priest and his love for Rosa Maria, caught in a situation where any choice would result in terrible consequences. The Mission San Jose continues to operate as a church to this day, now part of the San Antonio Mission's National Historical Park. Thousands of visitors walk through the building each year, most unaware of the tragic history contained within its walls. The small chapel dedicated to Rosa Maria remains a place of quiet contemplation. Though the full story of what happened there is not widely advertised by church officials, who prefer to focus on the mission's architectural and historical significance rather than its darkest chapter. But those who know the story come to stand in that chapel and think about Rosa Maria Delgado, 21 years old in her wedding dress, making an impossible choice in a moment of desperation, and Father Sebastián Montoya, torn between love and duty, making a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What is certain is that on September 14, 1879, a young woman walked into Mission San Jose to be married and never walked out, that she died alone in a small sealed room, while her family and fiancé waited for her at the altar, that the priest who loved her chose to hide her death rather than face the truth, and that she remained sealed inside those limestone walls for 40 years, a secret kept by stone and silence. Some who visit the mission today report feeling a profound sadness in the chapel dedicated to Rosa Maria's memory, as if the walls themselves retain some echo of the tragedy that occurred there. Others claim to have seen a figure in white near the altar, though these sightings are dismissed by church officials as tricks of light or overactive imaginations. What cannot be dismissed is the documented fact that Rosa Maria Delgado's body was found exactly where Father Montoya's journal said it would be, that the physical evidence matched his written confession in every detail, and that the truth about her disappearance was far stranger and more tragic than any of the theories proposed during the 40 years she was missing. If this story revealed something you never knew about the hidden tragedies that can occur in sacred spaces, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most. And if you want more untold stories of love, loss, and terrible choices that shaped American history, subscribe. These stories matter, not just as history, but as reminders that the line between love and obsession, between protection and betrayal, between devotion and damnation, can be far thinner than we imagine. They thought Rosa Maria Delgado had run away to escape an unwanted marriage, but the truth was that she had been in the church all along, sealed inside the walls by the only person who knew where she was, the man she loved, and who loved her, but not enough to save her from herself, or to give her the dignity of a proper burial. And in those limestone walls of Mission San Jose, preserved by the dry Texas heat and the silence of stone, she waited 40 years to be found, to have her story told, to finally rest in peace after decades of being trapped between walls, between worlds, between what should have been and what actually was.